Our first speaker will be Maddalena Cevese, who is going to speak on economic impacts in Argentina, inflation, economic crisis, unemployment, poverty, inequality. Hang on, let me just... Maddalena researches in political economy. Her main field of research deals with urban and environmental development, corruption and regional studies. She has worked in think tanks in Argentina and Colombia. And it's great that you're here today, Maddalena.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Collateral Global and to all the people behind the organization for setting this up. It's really great. Also, shout out to my friends and family that are online and watching this. So my paper looks at both the macro and microeconomic challenges Argentina faced during the COVID-19 pandemic, as to present a broader overview of the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19 lockdown policies. Essentially, the COVID-19 health crisis hit Argentina at a time in which economic activity was already suffering significantly. My main argument in my paper is that essentially the damages of lockdowns are so serious that it was largely irresponsible by the government to impose lockdowns onto the entire population, and that the decision to introduce several extended lockdowns of a period of a year was really a measure that the economy could not afford, not just financially, but definitely socially. Whilst there were emergency measures in place to counteract negative impacts of these lockdowns, the scope of which were definitely helpful, but largely ineffective when accounting for the overall consequences. In fact, Argentina found itself already with a long history of serious cyclical economic crises, and the kind of lockdowns that were introduced made the system even more fragile. We do see that the direct effects of lockdowns have further entrenched systematic economic insecurity, systematic inequality, growing poverty levels that rose to 42%, and rising levels of unemployment that already before the pandemic, just in 2019, were already at double digits. Arguably then, the government of Argentina has not sufficiently accounted for the losses and risks that these extended lockdowns entailed, and I personally argue that there is a concerning trend of a normalization of crises that in a larger societal context, it is already highly unsustainable. So looking at the macroeconomic impacts of the lockdowns, it is very important to account for the social costs and for the financial costs, and as such, looking at the levels of debt. In a context like Argentina that has already been suffering from decades of a so-called debt pandemic, way before the onset of this recent health pandemic. To zoom out, to understand the kind of economy that Argentina is, let's look at a few numbers. Argentina is the third largest economy in the region with a real GDP of 445 billion US dollars. As a direct effect of the lockdown, about 35% of the economic activity was completely shut down, an unprecedented scale of Argentina's economic history, which was estimated to cost the economy an average of $500 million a day. And just by the second quarter of 2020, the seasonally adjusted real GDP decreased to 383 billion US dollars. I know these are very large numbers, but they already give a crude idea of the severity of lockdowns and how Argentina found itself in a fragile state. Still, Argentina holds a very important economic importance in the region and on a global level. However, it continues to be marked by decades of recessionary cycles, uncontrollable levels of inflation, and rising levels of indebtedness that altogether have stifled the country's capacity. In fact, I must admit that also the history of debts has moved me to study the impacts of lockdown policies in an area that has already been suffering from such massive financial burdens. And going back to numbers, at the beginning of the pandemic, you see that the sovereign debt amounted to 311 billion US dollars, including a 57 billion US dollar loan from the IMF, which is an important feature to remember. Just a month into the first lockdown, the pressure on the fiscal space has increased so considerably that the $10 billion US dollar debt repayment obligation had to be deferred, which led to the immediate downgrade of the Standard & Poor's accreditation of the Argentine credit level, and which rendered future borrowing even more extensive. However, Argentina really had no alternative as to target the cost of the lockdown as with the issuance of further debt. Thus, by the end of 2020, the sovereign debt increased from 311 to 335 billion US dollars. These are numbers that hurt a lot, considering the fact that Argentina defaulted on 97 billion US dollars, so a third of which, just in December 2001, which was the biggest sovereign default in global modern economic history. And as such, the sharp rise in indebtedness through lockdowns brings forth critical concerns over the preparedness and resilience of the economy. And really, the longer this trend continues, the greater the risk of another sovereign default and the risk for Argentina to turn into a failed state. Just now in the news, it has come out that Argentina's inflation has gone up to 104%, which is the fourth largest in the entire world after conflict-struck regions like Sudan, Venezuela, and Lebanon. So, not only does this growing financial precarity reveal an extensive unaffordability of lockdowns, it also remains really unclear how debt incurred from lockdown policies will be paid back. It's a serious matter for any country really, but particularly for an area that faces these large pre-pandemic repayment obligations already. Argentina was also the only one of the six biggest economies in the region requiring emergency assistance. And the problem is, whilst the other countries had access to voluntary lending schemes with local and external creditors, Argentina's possibility to reach out for financial support was really burdened and also ineligible because they were already tied by large loans from the IMF, for instance, such as also the fact that other countries could access billions worth of flexible credit lines that Argentina could not access to. So it's also interesting, finally, to see that it's also interesting to see then that in many other aspects, Argentina's possibility to get financial support is very much stifled, and international creditors have such a strong force on the decision-making of the sovereign capacity of Argentina itself that they have little effective leeway to have a decision-making on their own trajectory, and also the majority of the population has little effective leeway in the turn of events. Here we're already. Sorry, this slide. So now look at the socioeconomic impacts of Argentina. And here it's interesting to see that indeed the state has implemented a wide range of policies and social assistance to minimize the costs of the pandemic. And in my paper, I illustrate how really many forms of social assistance are partial, biased, and also ineffective. Why do I say that? Because a closer look at the social assistance packages reveal very specific socioeconomic biases which could come to leave out many categories of households, people, and companies in need. Many categories of households and individuals were unaddressed and had to resort to other forms of economic support in order to compensate for the large reductions of incomes during the lockdowns, in order to secure their livelihood and, in many cases, also their survival. A study in Buenos Aires found that 4 out of 10 households sold belongings or used savings. Other 40% went into debt in order to meet their expenses. Another 11% requested loans from banks and state agencies. And also, again, these are the kind of numbers that show that the lockdowns were so severe that augmented a great deal of internal financial pressure alongside already the vast international pressure that Argentina experiences. I will now also look at the kind of social assistance packages that were in place just by taking 3 examples that illustrate how partial, biased, and insufficient they were. Fantastic. So basically, there is evidence in different support programs that show discriminatory practice. For instance, banks apply a preferential treatment to clients that already show a favorable credit history and a strong credit score, which is not necessarily given in a country that experiences such cycles and burdens where a lot of people have experienced bankruptcy and level themselves out of it. And as such, were already in financial needs and couldn't quite match the eligible criteria, or were eligible but they would not receive any support. And there are many examples, in fact, where just a small share of eligible applicants received any support package and paid also with a massive delay. In fact, the processing times and the confirmation of status of receiving such support packages were such, as it took such a long time, particularly for informal workers, that a lot of people were just left out. And this is particularly concerning also in a country that has quite a large informal economy. And informal workers, ipso facto, are excluded immediately from key labor rights with a limited monetary protection, as they have no they have no formal access to healthcare, no paid sick leave, no paid holidays, no coverage of professional absence, no pensions, and really no pay record. And in fact, there's a very concerning number that shows that only 12% of informal workers in Buenos Aires received state subsidies. 12%. And the majority of which were women. So a further look at the impacts of lockdowns show that women were adversely affected due to their overrepresentation in the informal economy, and of course also in their overrepresentation in frontline emergency roles such as caretakers, nurses, cleaners, and the like. And to give another number before we sum it up, a poll of 1,250,000 domestic and care workers in Argentina showed that 97% were women, and again, also a majority of which were migrant women because they didn't have to provide formal training nor legal residency. So all these figures show that, in fact, these different biases have led to a considerable escalation in poverty levels, despite the government's attempt to address increased vulnerability. Oh, I keep on forgetting this. I'm so sorry, the slides. I was so used to not use slides. So to conclude, there's really a possibility that Argentina reacted rather impulsively to international pressures following suit in global trends in the fight against COVID-19. The first lockdown may have made sense at the time of introduction, as the pandemic was a novel scenario and it required an exhaustive understanding on the epidemiological spread and harm. In hindsight, though, acknowledging what we know about the virus today and the aggravated economic hardships and the social costs caused by lockdowns, the decision of extending and reintroducing them at several intervals is really met with consternations. And in terms of the argument of insufficient consideration by the government for the increased social costs in an already precarious and debt-burdened economy, lockdowns have further moved Argentina in the already paved path of a notoriously long-term normalization of crisis. And, there's hope that conversations between the Argentine government and the IMF might help to extend the maturity of the country's significant existing debts, but this option cannot be the long-term solution, because for sustainability, we definitely need also debt sustainability. Thank you so much.